Hi, and welcome to StoryBee. I'm Frances O'Rourke Dow, and today I am talking with Caryl Bryer Fallert-Gentry, who is a quilter who I think needs very little introduction. I suspect you know who she is. She is internationally renowned. She was named one of the 30 most influential quilters in the world. She has exhibited her quilts internationally. She has won all the big awards. And moreover, I think that her quilts are almost immediately identifiable as hers for their use of color, light, movement, and energy. And it is an extreme honor and very exciting to be talking to you today, Caryl. Welcome to StoryBee.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, what I want to start with is your early days as a quilter. I watched a PBS interview with you that I think you did a few years ago. And it was interesting because you said you'd made your first quilt as fine art in 1983, but you made your first quilt in 1976. So I'm curious about what made you make that first quilt and how was it similar or different from the quilts that you started making in the 80s?
Well, I've always been an artist and a sewer. And in 1974, my first husband and I bought a farm in Missouri from a woman who had made quilts throughout the entire 20th century. And she wanted to meet us, and we went to her house and she opened her closet and it was floor to shelf, a big stack of quilts, and she started getting them out and putting them on the bed, and my jaw just hit the floor. And I was just so fascinated. I went right home and ordered a book on quilting from the Literary Guild and started out. There was something called a rail fence, and I knew how to sew, so I cut little templates. I cut around a cardboard template with 7/8 inch seams, or 5/8 inch seams. I knew how to sew, you know? And made a rail fence. And then I was at an age where all my friends were having babies, and so I made a whole bunch of baby quilts. And then we moved into an old farmhouse out in the country, and we spent a lot of time renovating. So it was 1983, kind of before, well, 82, before I started quilting again. I made a couple of traditional quilts. You know, every new quilter makes a blazing star, which is one of the most difficult quilts to make. They don't know any better. But then in 1980, late 82, I was working for United Airlines, and I was on a layover in Buffalo, New York. And I was working on a fairly traditional quilt. I had designed it, but it was traditional elements, hand quilting on my layover in Buffalo, New York. And I was running out of thread. And the woman at the front desk at the hotel sent me to a little shop down the street, and it was a quilt shop. And I had never actually been to a real quilt shop before. And I went in there, and at the front desk, there was a calendar of art quilts. And I had never seen anything like that before. I mean, the only quilter I knew was Mrs. Voss, the lady we bought the farm from. The woman who owned the shop said, well, if you're staying at the Williamsville Inn and you're a quilter, you ought to come to our lecture tonight. We're having Jean Ray Lowry talking about quilting or the breakfast dishes. And I thought, well, I didn't have anything better to do, but who would talk about quilts? I thought it would be somebody like 100 years old. And of course, Jean Ray Lowry was this very humorous, articulate, sophisticated Californian who made quilts as art and got paid for it. And not only that, she traveled around the country talking about quilts and got paid for that too. And this was kind of the epiphany of my life. I wanted the whole package. So I went right home and designed my very first art quilt, which is actually now part of the collection of the National Quilt Museum. And 15 years later, I was a featured speaker at that same conference in Buffalo, New York.
Oh, that's great. What was the name of your first quilt, the first fine art quilt?
Red Poppies. Okay. And it was kind of in a bed format, but it was a totally original design. It wasn't based on anybody else's pattern.
Well, tell us a little bit. So during this time, you've always been an artist.
Yes.
During this time that you're learning how to quilt, and I love that you took on such a difficult quilt as one of your first traditional quilts, because I think so many people do that not knowing any better. They take bigger risks at the beginning because they just think, oh, this is what you do. So I love that you did that. And then and then of course that you went on to make, and be inspired by Jean Ray Laurie. It's just a wonderful story. But I assume during this time you're also continuing with your fine art that's not non-textile art, we'll call it. Tell us about that. Tell us about how quilts became the focus of your artwork.
Well, I think once I did that first art quilt in 1983, we had moved into this old farmhouse and spent 4 years renovating. So I hadn't really set up my painting studio yet, but I had room to sew. And once I had made 3 or 4 quilts, as we all know, it's addictive. And I was really hooked. So at that point, I really changed mediums. And I think the fine art, the painting background and the mixing color background comes out in the fact that very shortly after I started making quilts, I started hand dyeing and painting fabric because I couldn't really get the palette I needed to express myself.
Mm-hmm. What can you do with fabric that you can't do with paint?
You can touch it and feel it and fondle it, and paint is icky and sticky and wet.
What kind of paints were you using?
Well, I did both oils and acrylics. I probably did more acrylics than oils, but a little of each. And I mean, you name it, I have tried almost every art medium at one time or another.
Mm-hmm.
But then at a certain point, I picked what I liked the best.
Yes.
Was fabric.
So it sounds like in some ways that fabric is more forgiving than paint. Is that true? I mean, once the paint is dried.
Yeah, it depends on the paint, oil. Well, oil, the difference with paint is you can put down 2 colors of paint and smush them together, which is one of the things I do in my dyed and painted fabric. But when you're making a quilt and you want that quality of shading, you have to use gradations.
Mm-hmm.
And almost my very first quilting, my very first out-of-town quilting class was a 5-day color class with Michael James in 1983.
Oh, wow.
I mean, just months after I made that first quilt. And he taught us to use Pantone papers to make gradations, which was life-changing. And I went right home and started organizing my fabric and gradations, and immediately realized I needed to dye fabric to get the gradations that I wanted. So the second big out-of-town class was a 4-day dyeing class with Jan Myers Newberry.
That was, I was about to ask, did you have to take a class to learn how to dye?
Right. And then, once you learn the basics, you go home and experiment. And I bought Deborah Lund's first book on dyeing, and she and Jan Myers Newberry were the ones who were using color the way I wanted to use it. I went to Quilt National in 1983 also. 1983 was a really pivotal year for me.
That was a big year for you. Now, so you've mentioned Michael James, you've mentioned, who was it who taught you to dye?
Jan Myers Newberry.
Okay. What other teachers or just what other quilt artists have been really important to you in development?
In that first calendar, I don't know. One of the first quilt books I bought had a Nancy Crow quilt on the cover.
Mm-hmm.
And, I was just impressed with, at that time she was making really blown up original or traditional designs, but they had lots and lots of color and contrast in them. Mm-hmm. And oh golly, who else? I would have to go back and look. I blank out on people's names. Well, I took a class from Ruth McDowell early on symmetry. And, all of these people were teaching very different things than they taught later in their careers. But I was influenced by the way they approach design and just their professionalism as artists.
Mm-hmm. Well, talk to us about your creative process. I know that the quilters love to hear about this because we're all involved in the same process. Whether our end product turns out to be remotely like yours or not, it's still the same. We're all involved in the creative process, and people have different approaches. So I know that I and most other quilters love to know, how do you make your quilts? Where do you get the ideas? How do they take shape?
Well, I kind of get ideas everywhere I go. I've traveled extensively my whole life, and everywhere I go, I see things. Even though I don't work pictorially, a lot of times my quilts are influenced by things I've seen.
Mm-hmm.
So let me just grab a quilt here because I can talk better if I can show you stuff. So this is a quilt that was inspired by snorkeling in Hawaii, and then later at the Great Barrier Reef in Australia.
Oh, wow.
Tilt the screen just a bit there so you can see the quilt. And this started with a little sketch I did the first time we got back from Australia. And it was much smaller than this. Originally, it was probably 2 inches by 3 inches. It was just a pencil sketch.
Mm-hmm.
And I made 2 other quilts based on that sketch, and then I went back to that same sketch again, and each time I refined it a little bit differently. So this would be the more refined sketch. Mm-hmm. And then I print that on clear acetate. I don't know if you can even see the lines.
A little bit, yeah.
This is the line drawing printed on clear acetate. And I use an overhead projector, which you'll see when we walk around the studio later. And I project it on the wall full size on a piece of freezer paper. And draw it with pencil. And then I put it on the table or the floor, depending on how big it is. And totally refine the big drawing so that I know where every seam is going to go and put in all my registration marks. Mm-hmm. And I actually go over the whole drawing when I'm done with pencil, which I can edit with my eraser. Then I go over it with marker because I draw on the paper side of the freezer paper, mm-hmm. but I'm actually working from the shiny side because all my fabric goes on the shiny side of the freezer paper. Mm-hmm. And so this is the final result of that whole process. Then I use the freezer paper. The freezer paper, of course, you can iron to the wrong side of the fabric and cut around it to make mm-hmm. templates. And I basically use what you might call traditional templates. Let me tip that down a little more. In that they have 1/4 inch seam allowances around all of them. But I use a different method, and I have extensive free tutorials on my applique piecing method on my website. So anybody can go there and see the whole process from start to finish in person. But basically, if I have 2 templates, I may have a little sample here. Let me just run off screen.
Yeah. We'll just look at these beautiful quilts behind you and your fabric.
Okay, so here are templates. Here's a template ironed to freezer paper. Here are another 2 templates ironed to freezer paper. And if you can see, oops, I need to hold
it again. Yeah, here we go.
2 templates, each have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. This one is folded over the edge of the paper.
Okay.
And this one is lying flat. And then I line them up on a light box. And I can show you this better later if you
Okay.
want.
And is that just Scotch tape?
It's just Scotch tape holding it together. A lot of times I use glue stick.
Uh-huh.
And I sew over the edge. If I hold this up, you won't be able to see it because it's invisible. But I sew over this edge with invisible thread with a 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter zigzag stitch.
Oh my
So
goodness.
it's kind of a hybrid between piecing and applique. I'm not applying this to another surface like you would with applique. But I'm stitching everything from the top and I'm lining it all up in the light box so I can see all my little registration marks. And so the whole thing just goes together like a giant puzzle.
I have so many questions and I need to be disciplined because we could go off on all kinds of tangents. So one question is, so when you are in the process of doing the sketches, are you also thinking about color, and are you thinking about the fabric that you have, or do you dye fabric in the process? Like, I need this color, and so I'm going to go make that color.
Sometimes, but not very often. And actually, usually I just draw the design. I do the line drawing, and then I may scan it into the computer and punch colors in just to kind of see how the relationships of colors are going to go. And, and almost always I do like a light dark sample, like black, white, and gray, a value study, because that's way more important than what color it is.
Okay.
I mean, I've done some designs in several different colors, but the lights and darks are in the same relationship. And
go ahead.
And so consequently, I kind of work out the colors as I go, but a lot of times I have a general idea. I mean, back when I was selling hand-dyed fabrics, there were a couple of quilts where I put the exact colors in, because then I was going, okay, this is this color, this color, this color, you can buy it on my website. But I'm not doing that anymore. And so I'm just kind of looking for relationships of colors. Everything is about gradations, because that puts the inner glow in the quilt. And then I'm using a lot of intersecting gradations. And if I tilt this up, you can see the quilt that is on the right back there has a lot of intersecting gradations.
Yeah.
And let me show you another quilt that has an even clearer example of that. This one is a very simple quilt called Electricellipsis #4. And I've done this in several different colors, but in each case, I started with the with one color and gone light to dark, and the other color and gone light to dark, and the same thing here. And these are kind of complementary colors, and it makes the eye vibrate.
Yes, it's just amazing the energy that it creates. Just the color itself is just, it's great.
It actually does something in the cones or rods or something of the eye that makes your heart beat faster.
Yes, it does. I can feel it. So,
one of the things that happened very early, even before I started quilting, early in my art career, right after I started flying for United Airlines, I had a series of layovers in Washington, D.C. This would be like 1970. And they had the big op art show at the National Gallery, and I got to see that in person, and it changed my life, and I've never recovered. And so, you know, I think if you look at like some of the Vassarellis and then all those black and white things that have all the movement, I have absolutely been influenced by that my whole life.
How much in your process, how much revision do you do? And do you do, I feel like you do variations on themes.
Right.
But in the actual process of making a quilt, are you going, that's not working, let me try something else? Or by the time you're actually on the wall or you have all that you're pretty sure of what you're doing?
Sometimes, but if I'm not sure, I don't sew it together until I am sure. And it's not at all unusual to pull a piece out and pull the fabric off the freezer paper and iron it to a different fabric and audition something else.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I swap out whole sections. On the other hand, I get to try a lot of things when I'm in the drawing process. So I do a lot of revision. You know, I do a drawing and then put it on the light box and do another drawing with a variation on that theme and another drawing and another drawing, and it kind of evolves. So a lot of my improvisation, you know, one of those quilting buzzwords,
Yes.
goes on while I'm in the pencil stage, and I can still easily erase. And then I go on the computer and try a lot of different colors. And again, I can try 6 variations and put them all on the screen at the same time and pick the one I like the best, or the one I like the best that day.
Yes. The one that's speaking to you. Now,
Right.
with your computer, because it sounds like particularly now you use your computer a lot and
Yes.
your design work. Are the colors pretty true?
Well, pretty true. And you have to understand that what I'm doing on the computer screen is sort of a guide map to where I might want to go. It's not necessarily the exact colors that I'm actually going to use. I have actually, one of the quilts that you will see in our living space gallery is a quilt in which I scan the fabric and put the actual fabric into the quilt design on the computer, but that's very unusual. Usually I'm just kind of getting an idea if the idea in my head is going to work, and as soon as I know that, I start going to free paper.
Now, here's a question, because obviously you've been doing this a long time.
Yes.
And you're brilliant, which you may not affirm, but it's true. We all know this, that you are in fact, you know, a genius artist. But do you ever fail? Do you ever just get halfway through something and go, this is not, I am not feeling this, or this is not working?
It has happened a time or two. It happens less often the more I can try the stuff on the computer ahead of time, but sometimes I just get tired of a project. It hasn't happened recently. I got really bogged down in a very large quilt a year ago. It took me 14 months to finish it because it was huge, and I was just so tired of working on it. When you get too close to something, you really get sick of it. You don't have any perspective on it. And I just got a huge burst of creative energy as soon as that quilt was done and off the quilting table. And then it got into Quilt National, so I'm a lot more excited about that quilt now.
So you just put it away and came back to it, or just said, here, you guys take it?
Oh, I found myself putting a lot of tutorials online and cleaning the basement and, you know, all the kind of stuff you do when you're avoiding the creative project that you're bogged down in.
But that's so funny that once you put it aside, then suddenly you got that creative energy back, and that's suggestive that it needed at the very least to take a rest.
Yeah.
Now, there's so much I want to talk about, but I know we don't have you all afternoon. And I do want to talk, you mentioned about putting tutorials online, which is something you started doing maybe a year or so ago.
Retired, right.
So, and you are retired from teaching, is that right?
I retired from teaching basically in 2014. After my first husband died, about 6 years later, I got tired of being alone. And met this wonderful man named Ron Gentry, which is why my name is so long. And we were 2,000 miles apart. I was living in Paducah, 3 blocks from the National Quilt Museum, and he was living in Port Townsend, Washington, which is about as close to Paradise, not Paradise, California, but the other one.
Yeah.
And so we spent about half our year, and we would spend the winters in Paducah where it was lighter and a little warmer, and the summers in Port Townsend where it's perfect. And after a while, every time I needed something, it would be in the other studio. And we didn't really have room to expand the studio. I just had like a little teeny tiny guest room in the house that he was living in Port Townsend. And really no room to store anything or expand. And we found a house just around the corner that was bigger and had the perfect space. And I finally decided I needed all my toys in one box.
Mhm.
And so we left Paducah after the big quilt show in 2014 and moved permanently to this home in Port Townsend, where we are today.
And you consider at that point you were retired from teaching.
Well, yeah, I had, you know, my husband was disabled for 11 years before he died, and then I was on my own to support myself. So I really needed to make a living. And so I had an internet business, and I was traveling all over the world teaching, and I was making it. You know, I was doing just fine and financially independent. But you know, I was tired. And when we moved here, I never really enjoyed the retail. The retail started because my students couldn't get what they needed for my classes. And so I started providing hand-dyed fabric for the classes, and then might as well sell it online. So I started an internet business in '97. And it just kind of snowballed into this whole thing. And I had a gallery and a dedicated classroom in my studio in Paducah, and people came and did workshops there. But I never really enjoyed the retail part. And I didn't really need to do retail anymore in order to earn a living.
Mm-hmm.
But if I was going to keep teaching, I still needed to do the retail. And so when I closed my shop in Paducah and moved to the West Coast, that was pretty much the logical time for me to stop teaching. I taught a few half-day seminars after that, but at this point, I have the luxury of doing what almost every artist has said they'd love to do, and that is just stay in the studio and make art.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm enjoying that.
Good. Although I have to say, as you were showing us how you piece your app, I was like, oh, she's not teaching anymore, and I want to go learn how to do this from you. But you do have one of the world's most incredible quilting websites. And I'm wondering, is that connected to your stopping? So talk about your website, talk about what's available there. And we will link to it in the show notes, but I feel like it's an incredible gift just going but you talk about it. I'm not going to talk.
Thank you. I loved teaching. I absolutely loved teaching. I was just energized. You know, after you've taught for a day, the energy starts flowing both ways. And I learned so much from my students, and I just loved doing it. What I never loved was packing my suitcase and hauling my stuff all over the planet, and all the logistics it takes to get my students and me in the same place at the same time. And so what I missed after I retired was that connection to people. And also, I have 42 years of making art quilts, and I've learned a lot of things that I'm very happy to share. And so having my website as a teaching tool gives me the satisfaction of sharing what I've learned without having to haul my stuff around and all that logistical stuff, which I'm just tired of. I mean, I worked for the airline for 28 years. I taught and lectured for 30 years. Some of that was overlapping. I'm not 90 years old quite yet, but yeah. And so I decided at some point, I have the luxury of being generous, and I'm not sharing anything online that anybody else is still selling.
Okay.
I'm not sharing anything online that I didn't invent myself. But I'm sharing my creative process and the techniques that I've developed over the years. And I'm happy for people to use them. I'm happy for shops to teach high-tech tucks, for instance. They just can't print it out and sell it in the shop, but they're welcome to use my tutorial and teach it in the shop. And anybody can download the patterns and instructions that I have And I've got several places where I share the entire design process on a major piece of work from start to finish, so that people can see how I work. And the one that is about the, what is it called? Fossil Fantasy. If you look at that tutorial, there's even a supply list at the end. You know, because I show stuff in my studio, and then here's where you can get that, or here's where you can learn how to build that. So,
right. And those, that is, I have to say, one of my favorite part of your website are that where you go through the process, and it's very detailed. I mean, it's like, here's kind of where the idea came from. Here are my sketches. Here's the, and it's incredible. And so I really want to encourage people to go look. And we will again include links in the show notes, because it's very special, and it does feel like, again, that you've given this gift, which in this day where very few people do anything for free, you're just like, because you could have put it behind a paywall and people would have paid.
Well, yeah, I just didn't want to deal. The amount of money that would come in from that was not worth doing all the accounting that I would have to do. I am so not good with simple arithmetic that, you know, I have the luxury of retiring.
Yes.
So here I am. I'm 71 years old. I'm entitled to retire.
You are allowed. You have worked very hard. Well, tell me about, so you were retired, but you're obviously still making art, and you know,
work. I'm still exhibiting my work.
So that, which is wonderful, and everyone should. It's so amazing to see a quilt in real life that you've only seen in pictures. I think it's such a different experience. So, if I bring up your name to someone who maybe knows something about quilting but doesn't really keep up with the quilting world, probably say, "Oh yeah, she's the one who won Paducah with the machine quilted quilt." Right. So first of all, just for a little, I want to talk about that just for 10 seconds, because you may be really tired of talking about that. And I want to get to a larger career question. Were you surprised that, I mean, some people were scandalized by that.
I was absolutely flabbergasted. I mean, I knew when I was making it that this was the best quilt I had ever made. But I was absolutely confident that there was no chance it would win Best of Show, because that had never happened. And, this was in a time when Meredith Schrader used to call the winners and let them know. And
beforehand.
Yeah. And, when she told me I had won Best of Show, it was probably the most excited I have ever been in my entire life. I mean, just over the top.
Yeah.
So, and I know that they got a lot of bad letters from people, and a lot of people were scandalized. But I really didn't get very much of that. I mean, I stood in front of my quilt in Paducah and talked with people, and I did see a few people stomping off. Most of them were not nasty to my face. And for one who went stomping off, someone came up and whispered in my ear and said, "Good, now I can finish my quilts."
You know, what's interesting is that people have been machine quilting their quilts forever, but I guess just, you know, which surprised me, but I've been studying about.
As soon as they invented the sewing machine.
As soon as they invented the sewing machine, people are going, "Hey, I know what I can do to make this process go a lot faster." But it was such a strong tradition in competitions, but I think that you broke through a ceiling that a lot of people were glad to see broken through. But I have to say, as I was, you know, thinking about that, I'm like, I'm so glad for you. This was pre-Twitter and Facebook.
Yeah, right.
It could have been a different experience. Okay, so you are known for that, but I think that your career is so obviously is 100 times more than that. So what you know, what do you want to be known for? What do you want 100 years from now, the quilt historians, to write about you?
Yeah, oh gosh. Well, I think about my quilts, I guess I would like to be an artist who left behind things that made the world a more beautiful place. And I absolutely don't disparage anyone who does political art and points out problems that we need to address, but that's not me. I I really believe that part of the solution, if not the whole solution to problems, is to focus on what we would like instead. And so I'm trying to make the most beautiful images that I possibly can that hopefully will lift people's spirits and make them feel better.
Mhm.
And the other thing I suppose I'd like to be known for is helping people find their own creativity.
Mhm.
I remember one time when I was teaching a 5-day class in Australia, about the third day, a woman who was probably 55, 60 years old leaned back in her chair and said, "For the first time in my life, I feel really creative." I just went, "You just made my whole trip to Australia worthwhile."
That's
So
amazing.
that's what I'd like to be known for.
Mhm. Well, again, I think through your quilts certainly, which are inspiring, and the patterns and the all the things that you put out into the world, you're doing that, and you have done that. So and I have to say I'm very excited. We're about to walk through your studio and see some of your work and some of the ways that you do your work. I want to say thank you so much for talking with us. This has been amazing. You just are you're um, again, just one of the quilt world's most amazing quilters. And so it's a thrill to talk to you. And now we are going to go take a studio tour. So thanks, Caryl.
Thank you.